Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God. I'm going to start just a little bit early this morning because our video is 53 minutes this morning. So we're not going to do any of the questions and stuff. We'll do that next week because long video, lots of questions. And so we're going to do that next week. And let's start with prayer. Father, thank you for all that you do for us. Thank you for protecting us through the storm. We've been blessed, and there are many that are struggling. We think this morning of Pastor Joe up in Pinellas Park and the flooded house and all that goes into taking care of that, as so many here know. Just give him the ability to get through that. Thank you that many people are stepping up already to help him. The churches, or the trailers around the Gulfview Church up in Port Richey, basically leveled 3 different trailer parks around. Just watch over them and allow that to be a ministry to those folks from the church there as they go out and assist. And the damage and all the issues going on in other places like North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee and on and on. And Father, you're aware of all that, and we just are praying for those that we know in those areas, that you would watch over them and protect them. And as we continue to study and learn, we trust that you would be honored. Thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, this is the next to the last video, and it's 53 minutes. So we're cutting it close. So if there's no questions, then we'll just get going.
Okay, now we've talked about 3 of the 4 ways that first responders in some ways resemble us as Christians who have a duty to make the case for what it is we believe, that want to train to get ready to make that case, that then begin to investigate so we can collect the data so we can make a case, and then now, finally, ultimately, turn a corner and actually learn how to present the case. And a lot of what we're talking about here, if we're talking about this in the context of evangelism, I mean, we could very easily just talk about the nature of the substitutionary atonement of Jesus on the cross, the nature of our sin, our fallen condition, and the solution that God offers. Of course, we want to do all that. I think we're just in a culture, though, that has more questions about the rightness of God and the goodness of God that require us to be able to answer questions. Because the minute we begin a conversation, there's a good chance that someone's going to offer an objection. And that's why we've taken all this time before we got to the doorstep of where we are right now and talking about how to communicate this to others. I realize this is a lot of foundational work, right? But it turns out that if you want to offer a 3-minute conversation or navigate a 3-minute conversation or a 6-minute conversation or, 1,000-word conversation about anything, you're going to have to know a lot more than 3 minutes or 6 minutes or 1,000 words of information. You're going to need know a lot more. If I want to be articulate about the case for my favorite football team, I'm going to have to know a lot more about my favorite football team than whatever I'm going to be able to communicate in just a few minutes. And this is why we're taking the time to look at the underbelly, to look at the story, to look at the facts, to develop the facts, to learn how to investigate the facts, so that then we can offer a reasonable, rational, sensible view of the gospel, a view of what it is Christianity teaches, a reason why we believe that we have a sin nature, that we can trust what the Bible tells us about both us and about the Savior. Why do we think the Bible is reliable? Why do we believe that there's a God that exists at all, that could come to us by way of special revelation and reveal himself to us? This is the stuff we've been talking about so far. And now we will turn a corner and look at the 4th dimension of what it is to be a case maker. And of course, we're doing that from our book, Forensic Faith. This class really is kind of built on all of my work, but I wanted to kind of focus at this very end here on this book, which talks about the 4 ways that first responders are similar to us as Christians. And these are the 4 ways. We're in this last section here on convincing communication. Now we're going to talk about 5 principles that'll help you share what it is you believe. Now, look, a lot of us have to share truth claims on a regular basis that have nothing to do with Christianity. And I had to do this for a number of years as a case maker. This is my partner in crime in doing all of this. His name is John Lewin, and John is a DA in Los Angeles. And all my cold cases, we worked on these cases together. Together, we figured out who was our suspect, gathered the facts. We obviously had a sense of duty, and we had prepared for years to do this. And now we actually get a chance to assemble those facts and present them in front of a jury. And I will tell you that John is an excellent. I don't think there's anyone better at prosecuting cases anywhere in the country, let alone Los Angeles County, than John Lewin. Just Google him if you want to know how powerful John Lewin has been in his career prosecuting cases. And I feel like I've contributed to that because the first 18 years of both of our careers, we spent attached at the hip doing these cases together. Now, I will tell you, when John closes a case and presents a case and communicates a case to the jury, he pretty much has a script that he sticks to. And almost always he starts off with the jury in closing argument, sounding something like this, where he'll say, when Detective Wallace brings me a case, he has the difficult task of releasing it to me for the trial. All the effort he spent investigating and preparing the case for filing is complete. Now, stop for a second there. This is what we've talked about so far, how to gather the facts based on our duty and how we've prepared ourselves to prepare a case with the facts to present for filing. Now says John, now he has to hand the case over to me for the jury trial. I know it's difficult for him. It's hard for him to trust me with his hard work. In fact, I bet he still thinks he could have presented the case better than I did. Now, sadly, I think that's probably true. I not that I could present it better than John, I can't. But as the arrogant person I am, I often thought I could. So I want to share with you something about closing arguments. People ask me this all the time, Jim, where is it you really win your cases? Where is it you knock it out of the park and at that point that you're going to be okay as far as presenting the case? It's not an opening statement. You might think it is. You've seen these in jury trials where you make this opening statement to your jury and it kind of summarizes where you're going to go and what your claims are going to be. And then you spend a bunch of time in the evidence presentation over a series of weeks. Well, this isn't even where we don't win the cases at opening statement, and we don't win them at evidence presentation. We also don't win them, surprisingly, in closing argument. And we don't even win them, of course, during the deliberation of the jury. You know where we win cases? We win it over here at jury selection. Yeah, I know that's sad, but it's true. If you don't pick the right jury, nothing good's going to happen after that. Jury selection is key. If you pick people who are never going to agree on anything, if you pick people who are contentious, picking the jury is essential. So let me give it to you as the first principle of communication. And that is, you got to pick a jury, and you got to pick it well, insightfully. I'm looking for 3 things in jurors. I'm looking for people who are passionate. Sometimes people will try to get off the jury in a very passionate way. They don't want to be on a jury, and they'll make that clear pretty early on to the judge. And the judge, for the most part, will say, well, sorry, you're enjoying the benefits of a free republic and a democracy. You're going to have to contribute in some way. And he recognizes that passion in trying to get off, that's the exact thing we're looking for in trying to put you on. So we're looking for passionate people who care, give a lick about what happens. And we also want people who are unbiased. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we're looking for people who aren't so full of themselves that they won't hear any other voice in the courtroom. So we start off with a room full of potential jurors. We know we've only got room for 12 in the box, maybe 4 to 10 alternates, depending on the length of a trial. And the room is full of potential jurors. How do we figure out which of these potential jurors we're going to put in the box? Well, that's something I want to teach you right now, because it turns out that there is a spectrum of bias, a continuum in every jury room. You might start off with 100 jurors, but in that room of 100 jurors or so, maybe 70 to 100 jurors, you could kind of divide the room in half between the people who are generally more supportive of the prosecution and the people who are generally more supportive of the defense. Like maybe there's people there who have family who are in law enforcement or in the DA's office. They are generally more supportive of prosecutors because they've had a good experience. Or you've got people who have been falsely accused of something and they don't trust police officers. They don't trust defense team. So or prosecutors rather. So they are more inclined to side with the defense team on these issues. Now, in these two potential groups that are in that room full of potential jurors, these can be broken into two more categories. You've got number one, those people who are so supportive of the prosecution and police officers that the minute they see someone walk in as a defendant and wearing the jumpsuit, they just think, hey, if he's here, he's got to be guilty, because there's a lot of people who don't even get this far in the system. So if he's this at this point in the system, he's got to be guilty. That's how supportive they are of anyone on the prosecution side. Now, twos are people who are generally supportive of prosecutors and police officers, but they're fair. If there isn't enough evidence, they will not convict someone wrongly, even though they support generally the prosecution side. Now, threes are people who are just the opposite. They generally support the defense team, but if there's enough evidence, they will prosecute. They will, convict rather, because they feel like, hey, you got to be fair. And they are open, fair-minded people who generally side with one side, but they are fair. Now, the fours are the people who are so supportive of the defense team. They figure, hey, if a cop is here, that's a liar. By definition, cops are liars. We can't trust them. We can't trust prosecutors. The system's corrupt. And I, from the very beginning, know that a corrupt system only brings in unfairly accused defendants. Therefore, I am already committed to the defendant. Okay, this is the spectrum, 1 to 4. Now, both of us are going to be working, both teams, the prosecutor team and the defense team, are going to be working hard to impanel a jury. And what we are trying to do is eliminate 1s and 4s. We want 2s and 3s. Yes, we get it. People are going to be on one side or the other generally, but we want people who are fair and reasonable and are passionate and are willing to set aside whatever preconceived ideas they have to fairly assess the evidence. Well, look, when you're sharing the gospel, if you walk into a plane, let's say, and you sit down, you got odds. The odds are that people on that plane are divided largely into two groups. You got probably some believers, and you probably got some people who aren't believers in the same group. And you don't know who you're going to sit next to and be able to share a spiritual conversation with. So these are the two groups. And by the way, these two groups are divided in half as well, just like the jury room is divided in half. Number ones are people who are so committed to their Christian worldview that they don't like, they're like, hey, I don't need any evidence for this. I believe it. As a matter of fact, if you said you had the body of Jesus, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't care if it was false, to be honest. It's so good. It's done so much great goodness in my own life and my family's life that I wouldn't even care. I'm in. You're never going to dissuade me from being a Christian. I am that committed. Believe it or not, there are people who are like that. They don't even know if there's any evidence to support the view. They don't care. They are in. They are committed. Twos are people who would say, no, I identify as a Christ follower and I understand the gospel and I'm in, but I have days where I'm like, I don't know. It seems like hard to believe, or I have my doubts. And then you got threes, or people who are like, yeah, I'm not a believer, but there are days when I think, well, maybe it could be true. And then you got fours. Fours are people who are absolutely anti-God, anti-theist, anti-Christians. They think that this is actually a source of harm in the world, and they are out. They're not. They think it's an evil. So look, anytime you're having a spiritual conversation, I call this the 3/4 principle. I could be talking to a room and I don't know who's in the room. A good chance 3 out of the 4 are paying attention to anything I have to say. They're open to anything I have to say. But that group number 4 probably is not. And this is what, if you look at Twitter, there's a lot of 4s on Twitter. This is the spectrum from which we are going to select a jury. Now, look, you would not just impanel a 1 and a 4. The defense team would never allow a pro-prosecution 1 on the panel. The prosecution team would never allow a number 4 pro-defense person on the panel. We actually make choices about who we're going to impanel. We have a question system, a voir dire system, in which we are able to ask the kinds of questions to figure out, where do you stand from 1 to 4? Look, we end up, though, preaching the gospel or sharing the gospel with people with whom we don't have any idea. We haven't even taken the time to ask a few questions to see where on this spectrum they fall, because it seems to me that we would take a different approach with each person on this chart. You know, like I have ones in my life and ones that I've met who would say, you know what, I don't need any evidence. Don't bother. I'm already a Christian. I'm in. You don't need to convince me. Nothing can convince me otherwise. I'm so committed to this. I don't really care what you have to say about it. Okay. Those are ones. I always ask ones, do you have any kids? Because if you have kids, they're probably a two. Are you prepared to share the case for Christianity with the twos in your life who want to know, why do you believe this is true? You may not need to know why it's true, but I bet you the kids in your life need to know why it's true. If you're a one, you need to know what I'm not still going to share what I know about Christianity with you, because it turns out that you probably have twos in your life. And if you're a two, you got doubts some days. Well, then you want to know why it's true. You want to know, is it really true? Do I have any good reason to believe this is true? Is it just my own blind faith, my own will, my own desire that makes I'm forcing myself to believe this? Or is there actually good reason to believe this, even if I wasn't raised this way or had parents who believe this? So, of course, twos and threes, we're trying to share the case with them because they have questions and they want to hear the answers. Then you got those fours. What do you do with fours? Folks who are so anti-Christian that they won't even give you 2 seconds. People on Twitter who are basically just hammers looking for nails, and you're the nail. What do you do with these folks? Well, I have a certain approach with these folks. I pray and I model Christ for these people. Do I share with these people? Of course. But I also know I've got probably appropriate expectations for what's going to happen as I'm sharing with these folks. I do. I have appropriate expectations. I don't expect the kinds of response I would get from a two or a three, but I'm praying for these folks and making sure I don't lose my character in front of them. I've got people like this in my own life. My dad has been in a position for. I just got to pray and model Christ for him so that when God does what only God can do, which is to move him from position 4 to position 3, well, then he's going to hear what I've had to say. He probably will recall most of the stuff we've already talked about. But my point is, I know that my argument's not going to win someone. God is the one who flips that switch, who gives you the ears to hear, that softens your heart so that you are willing to hear the case. So I am modeling Christ and praying for fours, paying close attention, because I'll notice when they've become a 3. And this is why when we train high schoolers to go to Berkeley or to go to any of these immersive experiences where we're asking them to share their faith on college campuses, they end up training and creating shirts, most of which look like this. I will be praying for group 4. It's always important to pray before you go. Let me give you another principle in this session. You've got to instruct your jury evidentially. We don't just pick a jury. Of course, we take great care in making sure we don't have 1s and 4s. We put 2s and 3s on our panel. And then we don't just expect them to understand how the evidence works. We're going to give them jury instructions. So some of the jury instructions that we give jurors are also good for us to remind the people we're talking to. It'll help them. For example, this simple one you already know. I've already explained it to you that there are only 2 categories of evidence, right? We've talked about this: direct evidence and indirect evidence. You remember, direct evidence is just eyewitness testimony. Indirect evidence is all the other stuff. We also call that stuff circumstantial evidence. Remember, we went through that whole process with this guy and we said, well, how do we make a case? How do we make the case with just an eyewitness? We talked about this, right? This is what direct evidence cases look like. And then we talked about how to make the same case using several pieces of indirect evidence. And these indirect pieces of evidence, they're also called circumstantial. It's when we put these all together, that's the weight of the cumulative nature of circumstantial evidence that is persuasive in front of juries. Well, this is what we talked about, right? We said, hey, it's still possible that he's innocent, but it's no longer reasonable because the weight of this evidence all points to the same conclusion. Now, the reason why this is important and the reason why we must take a few minutes to describe the difference between indirect, which is called circumstantial evidence, and direct evidence is because we know that people will say, well, you have no hard evidence for Christianity, or there is no evidence for the Christian worldview. Really? Well, you already know that's not true. And a lot of it is because they don't understand the difference between direct and indirect, and they think that circumstantial evidence is inferior. And we've already talked about this. It's not. It's to be treated with the exact same way. This is one way we can help our assessors of the evidence for Christianity understand that the stuff we're going to be talking about is evidential by its nature. And we also, to help them with this second jury instruction, to understand the difference between possible and reasonable. I always say it this way: anything and everything is possible, right? It's possible, for fact, as a matter of fact, that we're not even experiencing this day, that last night somehow the entire planet was captured by an alien force that now has brought all of us up into their motherships, and now we are all attached to this table where they put us in this alien-induced coma, and they're examining us, right? This is all possible. How would we even know if it wasn't possible? Everything is possible. Anything is possible. But we would say at least this is not reasonable. There's a difference between possible and reasonable is the standard in jury trials. That's the highest standard available. Why is this important? Because people will sometimes say, well, I need all this evidence. I need a certain standard. Like they're going beyond a possible doubt as their standard for whether or not Christianity is true. Just remind them that that's not the reasonable standard for anything. You don't know anything beyond a possible doubt, anything. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. This standard we use in jury trials is also a good standard for examining the Christian worldview. Let me give you a third jury instruction we give. Remember that because it's only a reasonable doubt, not beyond a possible doubt, that means you're going to have unanswered questions. Every case has unanswered questions. Get comfortable with your unanswered questions. Remember, I told you, I think about this case I had in which a woman was missing and her husband had killed her and gotten rid of the body. And 30 years later, we were actually able to arrest this guy. And of course, he made a bunch of statements in trial, right? And nobody believed anything he said. And we didn't have really any good evidence. We had a lot of unanswered questions, so many unanswered questions that people didn't believe we had a good case. The people in Dateline certainly didn't think we had a good case. People in the jury and the courtroom didn't think we had a great case. The jury, though, did find him guilty, even though he couldn't answer incredibly important questions. And after this is all over, with all those open, unanswered questions, he ended up confessing to it. So we knew that we had the right guy. He confessed to it after he was convicted, even though we couldn't tell you how he killed her, where he killed her, what he did with her body, how he moved her car, a ton of unanswered questions. Yet they still convicted him. And here he is. This is all based on the fact that you have to be able to make a decision. We tell jurors all the time. And this is the instruction in front of jurors, so you can see it, in California at least. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. That's a jury instruction given by the state of California because that's true. Anything you think you know, I could level some possible or imaginary doubt. So get comfortable with that, right? You're not going to be able to answer every question. This is important for us because do I still have open questions about God? Yes. About the Christian worldview? Yes. But is it possible for me to make a decision that this is true, even though I have an unanswered question? Is it possible for your hearers? Yeah, this is about a matter of making a good jury instruction so they can understand this is the nature of all decisions. All verdicts come at the end of an evidence trail that points you in the right direction, but you have to take the step over the end of the evidence to the verdict. Same thing is true in Christianity. There's lots of good evidence for this. You're going to make a step over the end of the evidence trail to a decision for Christ, because you can't answer every question. Let me give you another jury instruction. Witnesses don't agree. That's okay. That they don't agree. And sometimes you can tell because you can solve things because the order of the witnesses will explain why they don't agree. When I go out, I get called out. I think I told you this. When I get called out to a crime scene as a homicide investigator, I will always ask the dispatcher as she's calling me out in the middle of the night. I only have one instruction for the dispatcher. It is this one. Are officers still on the scene? Great. Have them separate the eyewitnesses. Have them separate the eyewitnesses. If you don't separate the eyewitnesses, you're going to get one story told 5 or 6 times because they're going to get together and talk about it before I get there. Don't let them do that. Separate them. I'm looking for variations in their testimony because that's the nature of true eyewitness statements. No eyewitnesses ever agree entirely. They shouldn't. It's just not the nature of human recollection. So let's say I get to a scene and the officers have separated out the eyewitnesses and now they bring them to me one at a time. And so I start this interview and the first witness says, okay, yeah, as a robbery occurred over here. Yep. And the suspect was a guy who wore a white t-shirt. He had jeans on. His hair was kind of short. He yelled a lot. Okay. So it's clear when she's just unprompted and she gives me the story, I just say, what happened? And this is what she says. What did he look like? This is what she says. Well, here's what she's focusing on. She's focusing on what he wore, his physical appearance, and what he said, what he wore, what he looked like, what he said. I asked the same open question to the next guy, and he says, okay, he wore a t-shirt and jeans, his hair was blonde, he demanded money. Well, there's a little bit of a difference there. I mean, he's not saying precisely what the first witness said, but he is answering the same 3 questions. Next witness comes up. Yeah, he wore a short sleeve shirt and jeans, and he was a white guy. He screamed at the clerk. Well, pretty much the same, but some new information. But to be honest, it's I can see some variation here, but it's close. He's actually still answering the same 3 questions. Well, you see behind him there's a guy in the shadows. And that guy in the shadows over there is somebody who should have been separated out, But for whatever reason, he wasn't. And the officer's thinking, hey, this is not somebody who it matters, I guess, because they haven't separated. No, it turns out this guy's another witness. He should have been separated out. He's now been listening to the testimony of the other three as they've been interviewed. Oh, great. So you see this is now happening. You figure out this guy's actually another witness. So you say, come on over here. And he comes over and he then begins to have an interview with you. And this is what he says. He says, he's a regular customer, you know. And afterwards, he ran out to a white van. Now, remember the first three? They were answering questions in these three categories. But this guy's not answering these questions at all. He's answering really more questions of identity. Who was this guy? And what did he do afterwards? You could ask this guy the exact same open-ended question, but you'll get different answers from him than the other three. This almost always happens this way. And why? It's because he has already heard what the others have offered. He already figures that's close enough. That's what I saw too. But they didn't say this. Let me fill in for you without even being prompted or asked by the interviewer. He now is going to fill in details that he wasn't even asked to fill in because he's overheard the other three. Something similar happens in the Gospels, right? You have an event and an eyewitness or somebody who's speaking or writing for an eyewitness writes down a version of it. As they were reclining at the table, this is the Lord's Supper, and eating, Jesus said, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me. So in Mark's gospel, you see that he's answering these two questions. Where were they? And what did Jesus say? That's in the scripture. Here comes somebody new. Matthew says, as they were eating, he said, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me. That's slightly different, not enough to make, but it is, you can see how somebody could try to parse that out and say, well, but again, he's answering the same two questions at least. Now, here comes a third version. But behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with mine on the table. Oh, some new, well, I guess you could assume that, but this is, well, at least he's answering the same two questions. But you see the differences between these accounts? So between Matthew, Mark, the first, Matthew, then Luke, you have some slight variation, but at least they are focused on the same things. Then comes a fourth witness, somebody who's been kind of lingering in the wings and is already familiar with what the first three had to say. So when John shows up and gives his testimony, his sounds very different. There was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. That's interesting. He puts that in. And then so when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Now, look, the other three are really focused on these two questions, but that's not where John's focus is. John's got a completely different focus. Why? Fourth witness, being interviewed, knowing what the other three said. He's filling in details. This is the nature of John's testimony. He is definitely filling in what the others left out. So it turns out that I expect these to be different because that's what witnesses do. And I also expect that the last one, if he's heard what the other three have had to say, will be markedly different in his depiction. And he is for the most part. If you look at John's gospel, there's some fresh new information there that you don't find anywhere else. Let's go to evidence instruction 5, jury instruction 5. Did you know that a witness can be wrong and still be deemed reliable? It's true. Now, I'm not saying that any of the gospel eyewitnesses are wrong, but just for sake of argument, this is a principle in jury trials. Look, I've had a case in which someone was murdered at a restaurant in our city. You can see this as a scrapbook from this. And we had a worker there who was being interviewed in this picture. She was somebody who was a co-worker of the victim. And as a matter of fact, this is the woman who discovered our victim's body the very morning of the murder, after the murder. And she came back to work. She had actually switched shifts with the victim. She would have been dead if she had stayed to work that night, but she switched the shift. Her coworker took over for her. The next morning, she comes in to work the coworker's shift, and she sees that the coworker's car is in the parking lot still. And she immediately panicked because she knew this car should not be here. That hair on the back of her neck ran up. She ran into the building. She opened the door, and she finds her coworker dead on the floor. This witness was going to be a critical witness for us. She's the one who discovered the victim. Her name was Karen. And one of the questions that was asked of her in the cross-examination by the defense team was, hey, and it was a big deal for us because we needed to know that the door was unlocked. Is this somebody, when you first got there, was the door unlocked, or was it locked? Do you remember? Was that doorknob locked or unlocked? It became critical to the sequence of events, but that's another story. But the point is, Karen got it wrong. She couldn't remember, and she said the wrong thing. And so then, of course, the defense team just hopped all over her and said, well, if you can't trust, this is a simple thing. If she's wrong about this, what else is she wrong about? She's going to give you all kinds of information, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You can't trust any of it because she's been wrong. We've demonstrated that she's not right. She's incorrect. She's made a mistake. But the jury, in the end, found her to be a reliable witness. Why? Because a witness can be mistaken about a particular detail, yet still be considered reliable. Now, I'm not, again, suggesting this is true for the gospel authors, but even if it was, for sake of argument, you couldn't level it against them to prove they are unreliable about everything. But just keep this in mind, that the standard is much lower than most people think it is to determine if something has happened in the past. This is the jury instruction for this kind of thing. Do not automatically reject testimony just because of inconsistencies or conflicts. This is an instruction. Most people, of course, will never give this kind of grace to anything that has to do with Christianity, but that's not my point. The point is, this is the instruction. Consider whether the differences are important or not. People sometimes honestly forget things or make mistakes about what they remember. Also, two people may witness the same event, yet see or hear it differently. Let me give you another jury instruction. The more cumulative the case is, the stronger is the inference. Remember, we looked at this piece of this case here involving 8 pieces of evidence, right? And these 8 pieces of evidence all point. If you only had one of these pieces of evidence, you wouldn't really even have a good case, right? But what do you do when you have an outlier, some piece of evidence that seems like it runs against, like it could be used the opposite way, against your inference, against your conclusion? Let me put a bunch of pieces of evidence here on the chalkboard. Let's say they all point to one reasonable inference. Okay, those are all really, really definitive. Not all, but almost all. This one over here, though, this one can be interpreted one of two ways. It might be that I look at it and it's like, I can see how the defense could interpret it differently than I'm interpreting it in favor of my suspect. I could see how somebody might interpret it against, maybe it's not as good a piece as I thought it was. How do I interpret this outlier? I've got all these things that point to this guy, but yet this one is kind of neutral. Like, I'm not sure what to make of it. Do you remember when we were doing our artifacts and evidence, the idea that sometimes you can have things in the Bible that are, how do I interpret them? And we looked at that cell phones, we got these outliers and variations. How do we interpret these, right? Well, I will tell you, you've got one way to do it. You could reinterpret all of the other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pieces of evidence in light of the one, or you could interpret the one in light of the 9. You interpret the lens through which you look at the one that you're not quite sure about has to come through the lens of the things you are sure about. This is important for scripture, right? You've got a bunch of verses that point to one reasonable inference, and you got one verse that's kind of neutral. Like, I'm not sure which theological case this might support. Well, if I've got a lot of strong pieces of evidence that point to one theological conclusion, I ought to read the one that's kind of interpretive. I ought to read that and interpret it in light of the majority of verses that point to one theological conclusion. This is true for criminal cases. This ought to also be true for us when making theological cases. And how do we make these cases? How do jurors make a decision? You get a bunch of jurors together, and how do I decide how to do all this? Do I, I guess I could give them an instruction. Okay, so when you come down to making inferences, I want you to use a principle. I'm going to give you a philosophical principle. Maybe we'll talk about the likelihood principle of confirmation theory, or the odds form of Bayes' theorem, the degree to which evidence counts in favor of one hypothesis over another. Really? Could you imagine if I tried to teach my jurors about the likelihood principle of confirmation theory, or the odds form of Bayes' theorem? I can say, look, so you've got all this evidence I've given you. Evidence is the E, hypothesis. Okay, here's the formula. Just go back to the jury room and apply everything into that formula. I think we would be waiting for the jury for about a year This is not what we instruct. We don't have this high view, philosophical view of how you guide yourself to a proper inference. Here's the jury instruction. When we leave this jury to make a decision, and this is the same thing we should say when people are trying to make a decision about Christianity, because you will see people actually on the internet who will argue that if you can't use a certain theorem to come to a certain conclusion, you can't have any confidence in your conclusion. Really? Here's the jury instruction. Use your common sense. Just use your common sense, folks. This is now, I'll lead to evidence instruction, jury instruction 7. Your common sense is sense enough. Your common sense is sufficient. So let's say you had somebody, for example, who says to you, last night, my son, he's a great kid. He didn't come home on time. He was out really late. I'm not sure what to make of it. And his car, I saw that on the curb. It was like parked like at an angle. Like it wasn't parallel with the curb. Like I'm not even sure why he parked it that way. And when I went out there, I saw there was like a receipt crumpled up on the ground next to his car from a local liquor store for like a pint of vodka. I'm like, that's like crazy, right? Like, how did he, like, I don't get it, right? And then I see him wake up and he comes into the house and he's got this look on his face like he's miserable, like he's not feeling good. And his shirt he had when he left, it looks like he threw up on it or something. He looked terrible. He smelled bad. And then he walked right to the cupboard and he got aspirin out of the cupboard. And first thing he wanted to do is take aspirin. Okay. So if you're your friend, you're the friend of this lady or this man who's telling you this story, you're going to say, well, in order to properly understand what your son probably was doing, I think what you should do is you should use that Bayesian theory, that theorem, that formula. No, you're going to say, really? Can you use some common sense? I mean, put together the facts. It seems to me that your own experience, you were a kid once. Tell me, your son was out drinking. Come on. How hard is that to figure out? And this is pretty much what the instructions are to jurors. Look, in deciding whether testimony is true or inaccurate, use your common sense and your experience. You're grown adults. You've got some life experience you can tap into. Even when it comes to use of force, force is a factual question to be determined by the jury using its own common sense. Common sense, common sense, common sense. You see it over and over again in jury instructions. Let me give you evidence instruction number 8. The more diverse the cumulative case, the more reasonable. It's not just the size of the cumulative case, it's the diversity of the cumulative case. So, for example, if I've got this is a suspect in one of my cases, and we had several forms of evidence. We had some eyewitness evidence of things people had said about him, his own behaviors that were observed at the time. We had some forensic physical material evidence, and then we had some statements he made. And it turns out between the eyewitness evidence, that all pointed to him. The behavioral evidence all pointed that he was guilty. The forensic evidence pointed to him as the suspect, and so did the statement evidence. So we had 4 different disciplines. We were going to bring in 4 different kinds of experts, 4 lines of evidential value that we're going to bring in front of a jury. And they're very diverse. The experts that testify to one of these are not able to testify to others. They don't have that kind of expertise. 4 different categories of evidence. They all point to him. There's good reason to believe he's our guy because the diversity of the kinds of evidence that point to him. Well, look, even the evidence for God is similarly diverse. We've already talked about some of this, right? I think there are 8, and this is from God's crime scene, 8 lines of evidence that you can use to demonstrate that God exists. 2 of them are cosmological, 2 of them are biological, 2 of them are mental, and 2 of them are moral. And then the experts you might call in these areas are very different from one another. You don't have expertise. This is very different lines of evidence, all pointing to the exact same inference, all pointing to the existence of God. And from these lines of evidence, you can draw conclusions until you finally end up with a theory of everything. I can explain everything in the world, in the universe, by simply using God as the explanation. God is the theory of everything everyone's been looking for. Well, why do we know that? Because the best and the most diverse cumulative case you can build points to the same inference. Let me give you jury instruction number 9. There is a difference between a fact and an inference. And we have to help people understand that difference. Look, I'll put them on the screen here for you. You have facts and inferences. It'd be nice if I can go into a jury and just assemble the facts, and that every time I assemble the facts, it leads to the same inference. It'd be nice if all I had to do was give them jury instructions. Let me train you in the nature of evidence. Because I know if I do this, if I give you the facts, train you on how to evaluate the facts, you will always come to the proper inference. It doesn't happen that way, though. Juries are divided. They have different opinions, different views. Why? Well, because they're coming in. They are by nature wired differently. Every one of us is wired differently. We have a different set of data that we come from. Our memories are different. Our preferences, desires, our heart's desires are all different. And because those are different, we come to different inferences because these things, these factors, the way you're wired, your history, your personal preferences, your likes, your dislikes, your biases, these are the things that often weigh into the decision-making process. This stuff is huge. That's why we can sometimes end up starting off at the same place, yet over time end up in 3 different locations, even in decision-making, because this stuff is what guides our cars as much as the evidence itself. Now, we often look at, like, for example, I'll give you an example of this. There's scientific evidence we can uncover in cosmology, astrophysics, the biology, DNA studies, any kind of physiology, psychology, studies of mind, all of these things, right? And there are a lot of people who look at that evidence, the evidence from science, for example, they'll say, and they think that the best inference from that evidence is that we are just random evolutionary paradigm is can explain all of it. They'll say, yeah, the best inference is that Darwinism is true, that there is no God, that all that is working in the universe is space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. In God's crime scene, I look at that same evidence, the exact same evidence, yet I come to a different inference. Now we got to ask ourselves, why is it so some of us come to one from the exact same scientific evidence, you arrive at one inference rather than another? Well, of course, it's all that stuff. That's all it is. Now, have you ever heard this expression? This drives me nuts. Settled science. Like, you can't even argue about Darwinism anymore. Evolution is just settled science. Okay, well, there isn't, by definition, there's no such thing as settled science. And inferences are never settled. Now, is the science itself, are the facts gathered from a scientific, for the most part, if I come to your crime scene and there's a fingerprint there, okay, I lift the fingerprint, that's settled. I mean, it is what it is. The DNA I find there is what it is. But what I make of the fingerprint, what I make of the DNA, that's not settled. That's an inference. Don't confuse the two. Don't confuse the facts from the inferences. In the end, I'm still open to hearing what the inference is. Let me give you another evidence instruction, another jury instruction. Remember that because inferences are arrived at this way, all causal explanations shoulder the same burden of proof. You've often heard it said that only you Christians who believe in the invisible, flying spaghetti monster, well, it turns out only you Christians have a burden to show that there exists something that we don't see. Well, they're kind of misunderstanding the nature of how we use explanations to explain phenomena. So let me give it to you this way. Let's say we're at a crime scene and we're both standing on one side of the crime scene tape and we're looking at that crime scene and we see the same evidence. And I look at it as your partner and I say, I think the coworker is the one who killed this guy. And you look at the same scene though, and you're like, I don't know. I'm looking at the same evidence you are, but I think it was his girlfriend. Well, we're looking at the same evidence. If I think it's his coworker, I have a burden to show you why that evidence best points to the coworker. But you also have a burden because you've got an alternative explanation for this. And because you have an alternative explanation, you have a burden to support your alternative explanation. You think it's a girlfriend? Show me why from this evidence it's a girlfriend. Same thing happens when we look at the evidence in the universe, right? Back to God's crime scene. These 8 features of the universe. The universe has a beginning. It's fine-tuned. Life appears from non-life. It has the signs of design. There is a consciousness, free agency, moral truths, evil. These are the realities, the facts, the evidence that we find in the crime scene known as the universe. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't believe that God exists and you think you can get these 8 features of the universe with nothing more than space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, if you think that all of this can be caused by natural law, well, then you have a burden to show me how all of this can be the result of just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Now, I have a burden also. If I'm saying there's a divine being, I get that. And I'm willing to accept that burden. But just know that both people in this scenario, the one who says there's a divine being and the one that says there isn't, because if you're saying there's no divine being, then you also have an alternative explanation for this stuff. And that alternative explanation is that you think that this is caused by space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. That's your burden. That's your burden. Now we're going to go a little long here. We're already a little long, but I want to go through one more principle. I just gave you some rules. We select a jury carefully. We instruct them in the rules of evidence. I just finished doing that. We did 1 and 2. I'm going to go to the third of 5 forensic faith principles related to communicating the truth. And this is, you have at some point to make an opening statement. Now I've selected my jury, I've instructed them, and off we go. I start the trial by making an opening statement. And, I think we can look at models for this. I mean, there is no better model than Jesus of Nazareth for making opening statements. And he also would talk about the nature of communication, right? He says, see to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name saying I am he, and many will mislead, and they will mislead many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. These things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Do you think that the audience listening to Jesus, do you think he had their attention at this point? Nation will rise up again. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that grabs your attention, right? You are now off and running. I think at this point, pretty much whatever I say, people are going to listen, because I'm about to. This is a great opening. I just go back, for example, to John. John's a great opener, a wonderful opener. I end up building all of the visual presentations that John then uses in front of his juries. And John and we practice this stuff over and over and over again. How many times do you think Jesus, as God incarnate, I don't think that Jesus needs to practice. I don't think he does. But I'll tell you this, the hearers got to hear much of the same content from Jesus over and over and over as he went from town to town to town. If you want to make a good opening as a fallen human, we're not Jesus. We have to practice. And we have to be good students of people who do this well. So here's my challenge to those of you who want to do this well. I want you to start thinking about finding a place and set a time to practice sharing the truth of the gospel. Look, I mean, we used to do this in classes with students where we would break into sections and we would do this with each other, because the other person who you're practicing with ought to be somebody who shares that interest, right? Ought to be someone who you are close enough to that you can allow them to critique you. This is what John and I would do. We would do this in front of each other. Now, we were brutal with each other. We were brutally critical of each other's approach. I would build it visually. He would say it a certain way. No, you're saying it wrong. He would say, well, you got it wrong on the screen. Let's do it differently. I don't want to go that way. I want to go. We would fight like cats and dogs, but we would practice this thing over and over and over again. Are you in a place with somebody who you trust enough to be able to critique the way you are sharing the gospel? Let me say this too. Not only does he practice, he's very careful about his first impressions in front of the jury. That first impression does not happen at the opening statement. It happens over here at jury selection. When jurors walk in the room, that is your chance for a first impression. Jury selection begins as you're just talking to each other while the jurors are getting seated. We're maybe still a week away from impaneling a jury. They're still watching you. They're watching our interaction with each other. But if they're in the room, they're watching you. Jury selection begins way before the attorneys actually make an opening case. So we got to be careful the same way. We cannot ruin our opportunities to share the gospel by alienating the people we're trying to reach. And this is often the case, right? One of the hardest people to communicate the gospel to are often just the people who know us really well, and they know all of our ugliness, who we really are. That makes it harder. Another thing that helps John in making opening statements is he is eager and prepared. He is. You'll hear that the press, when writing about John, will say, "Oh, he's super passionate and he's fearless and he's bold. He's enthusiastic." Well, he is fearless, but that doesn't really capture though why he's so enthusiastic. Well, I've learned that there's a direct relationship between your level of preparation and your level of enthusiasm. There just is. Have you ever been when you were in college or in high school, and there'd be a class that it was hard, maybe a biology class or something, and they would say, oh, on Friday there's going to be a test, and Friday would come, and you would walk in the room, and there'd be somebody in that room who was so excited and energized because it's the day of the test, and you're like going, really? That's not who I am. Okay, why are you so dang excited? Well, you know why he's excited, because it's test day, and he's actually studied up. He's prepared, and we're not quite as prepared. And because he's prepared, he's going to show you now how much more he knows than you, because he is ready and excited to take the test. Look, the same thing happens for most of us when we have an opportunity to share our faith publicly. The people who are the most excited to share their faith publicly are the people who are prepared. They already know what they're going to say. They already know what the first words are going to be coming out of their mouth. They actually do this a lot. I have a friend who wrote a book called Unsilenced. His name is James Picardo. James is always prepared to begin a conversation, even though he knows the first few seconds are going to be rather awkward. But he doesn't care. He pushes through that period of discomfort, and he has the same opening line with strangers anywhere he happens to be. He'll find a way right away, very early on in the contact, to ask them about eternity. He'll say it this way. So what do you think happens when you die? He's prepared to say that. And he's done it so many times now. He's prepared to suffer through what discomfort there might be in the first few seconds, because right away, people will answer this question. And when they answer it, it's diagnostic. They'll reveal something about why they think, what they believe about their worldview, what worldview they hold. If they say, well, yeah, I think if when you die, you go back in the dirt. Well, you kind of know what their worldview is, don't you? Oh, when you die, you're reincarnated. You kind of know what their worldview is, don't you? Oh, you die, you go to heaven. Well, you might not know what their world. It might be like yours. It might still not be like yours, but it does begin to diagnose where they stand. Great way to start a conversation. If you know, I'm not going to have to figure out how to start. I just know how to start. I'm just going to push through the start. You will now be more prepared. And because you're more prepared, you're likely to be more enthusiastic. I've got another friend, Grover Peterson. He starts it this way. He'll say, I noticed you're you're wearing a watch. Well, watches are designed for a purpose. What's your purpose? Everything in life has a design function and purpose. What's yours? He'll usually point to something they have around them that has clearly been designed. Of course, this is a great way to start, because if purpose is attached to design, then you're looking for the designer who's designed you for a purpose. This is a great opening line. In some ways, this is even an easier way to back into a spiritual conversation, right? Look, I don't care how you start, but having this idea in your head before you start is going to help you to be prepared and be more enthusiastic. So just take a second to either adopt one of these or create your own comfortable opener. And then imagine how you would react to every possible response to the opener. Because these responses, they're only going to come in a variety of flavors. James Picardo and Grover, they both know that they've only heard 4 or 5 responses to the same question they ask of everyone, and they have now mastered the 4 or 5 responses. Pick your opener, write down what you think the possible responses are, practice the responses. Another thing that John does in opening statements is he makes promises that he can deliver. That's right. Let's go back to our sequence of a jury trial, okay? When you're in the opening, you're going to make certain promises to the juror. I'm going to call this person, is going to say that. I'm going to show you this. It's going to demonstrate that. I'm going to call this expert. He's going to say that. You're going to tell the jury, and the opening is not called an opening argument. It's an opening statement. I'm not allowed to argue here. I'm simply going to tell the jury what they are going to see during the trial. Well, then when I get over here to the actual portion of the trial in which we show the evidence, I'm going to have to show the jury everything that I promised them. And I can tell you, and by the way, at the end, the other side too is going to make promises. And if they don't deliver what they said they were going to deliver in the opening, we're going to remind the jury over here. We're going to say, hey, we promised you certain things in the beginning and we delivered all of it. The other side promised you things they didn't deliver. So we're going to show the jury that we actually delivered what we promised. Well, sometimes we will make claims in support of the Christian worldview that we really cannot deliver the goods on. We've heard something, there's a popular argument, a popular statement is made about God that really is not supported by the evidence, or I got this from a poor source. I've just learned never to cite something, for example, from the internet without you digging down to the primary sources to figure out if it's actually true. In other words, if someone challenges you, don't make stuff up that they can then find out you were lying about or find out that you weren't accurate about. If you're not sure about something, you know what to say, right? I don't know. I'm going to get back to you, though, because I do want to know. That's a great answer. It shows some vulnerability, some modesty, and it'll help you not make a promise you can't deliver. Another thing John does in openings is he captures momentum. So let's go back again to our trial now. We'll take out the jury's selection and just go with the actual trial in front of the jury. If your opening is really weak, if after you do the opening, it's so weak that it doesn't even feel like you've got a good case. We have a long opening. It's like it could be a day of opening. We want at the end of our opening for the jury to think, wow, if they just deliver what they promised, this dude is guilty. Like, we want to convince them early. If you don't do that, if your opening is insufficient, like it's weak, well, then it's going to be all uphill. It's going to be hard to get to the verdict. On the other hand, if your opening is super strong, well, then it's pretty much, you're just coasting. You're just delivering the promises you made. So let's do a good job of providing good evidence early, making a robust case early. That'll help you to kind of have the wind in your sails. And that's important, right? Because when you think about it, we have a good case, and we shouldn't act as though we don't. And we sometimes, I think, don't know the evidence well enough to know how good our case is. But if we could be thorough and complete to answer questions robustly, it's a lot easier to make the case. Your case is, or if you just don't know, then you're going to say, don't know, but I'm going to get back to you. And when you get back to them, that's when you're going to make this robust case that's strong, because you can then capture momentum. Okay, we've looked at 3 of 5 principles for communicating your faith. We'll finish up in the next video. But what I want to encourage you now is to think about this in the same process by which we select and make a case in front of a jury. It's jury selection, it's jury instruction, it's opening statements. In the next session, we'll wrap it up.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.